Hello, and welcome to the Tyk Holiday APIM Extravaganza.
Hi, Buddha. Thanks for having me.
And of course, together with us is our very own founder and CEO of Tyk, Martin Buhr. Hi, Martin. Good to have you here.
Hello. How's it going?
All good, man. We are about into the second half of this show, and hopefully people are enjoying this. Hopefully people do still remember that we have an ugly sweater contest that's going on as well. So definitely keep those pictures coming in. So for this segment, I'm of course really excited about this because we've got a full, 40 minutes to talk about what has come before and what we have to look forward to in 2023. But before we get started, perhaps a round of introductions. Obviously, I've given just the role title and name. That's probably not enough. But let's kick off with a round of introductions. Perhaps, James, if you could kick things off over there.
Sure. So, James Higginbotham, I'm the founder of LaunchAny. We are a consulting practice that focuses on helping organizations establish, grow, and mature their API programs. So we do training, consulting, work with organizations of all sizes.
Thank you so much, James. Over to you, Martin.
Hi, Martin Buhr, CEO and co-founder of Tyk Technologies. I co-found and run Tyk.
Well, as an icebreaker, perhaps let's look at 2022. There were a lot of moments, some of which actually Nathaniel touched upon as well, some of the trends that we saw in the early part of the session. But I'm really curious from you gentlemen here, was there a moment, an event that really stood out to you? Think about perhaps a human moment, maybe a tech moment, maybe a combination of those moments. What do you have in mind? I'm going to go over to you, Martin, perhaps to kick this off.
Hi, yeah. So I think I was gonna go with some of the geopolitical crap that's going on these days, but then I couldn't quite decide on which one to focus on because there's some pretty horrible stuff going on. So instead, um, I'm going to go with something that sort of happened recently. Actually, just it sort of seemed to have happened in the last couple of weeks, which is this sort of new generalized hype train with how fast AI is progressing. I don't know about other folks watching on the call, but our internal Slack has been all agog with what's been going on with ChatGPT and OpenAI. And it's been going on for a while. I think I wrote a blog post about it a couple of weeks ago, something similar. But it's just become, I think we've entered a sort of new phase of accessibility for this type of technology for the average consumer instead of the more techie developer type. And these synthesized models, these things that can literally create things out of the corpus of human knowledge and corpus of human language are fascinating for one because they're so bizarre. But at the same time, I feel like we're sort of on the cusp of something where once tooling is built around these events, I mean, we just had somebody talk about using OpenAI to build a tool for team collaboration. That's going to accelerate. There's already a tool now to comment your GitHub commits with ChatGPT. Things like that, just immediately appearing because this capability has suddenly become available. And while a lot of people don't really know what to do with AI, I think as at the moment, all the sort of obvious stuff is being done. So, direct content generation, direct image generation, video generation, things like that. But I think it's going to go further than that as those tools slowly but surely creep down the value chain. And I don't know if folks know this, but like it's already happened in gaming. These AI upscaling processes have been built into our graphics cards. So instead of having to render a 4K image, they render a 1080p image and they upscale it to 4K. But instead of doing it through an algorithm, they do it via this encoded AI model. And it's incredibly successful because it means that you don't even see the difference. I think the biggest sea change this year's brought in terms of tech is this normalization, or not normalization, but this sort of magic black box that is AI. And we're going to see going into 2023, 2024, some really interesting tooling built on the top of it that is going to be very cool, but also exceptionally creepy.
Well, that is very, very true. I think there was a trend around deep fakes that came up quite recent. I mean, a couple of years ago as well, which again was kind of, you could make out the difference, but there was a definite creep factor that was there. I mean, after you went past the, oh wow, that looks cool, but then the creep factor really set in really quickly. So absolutely agree with you. And AI is obviously not something that is new. It's been around for a long time now. It's again coming down to how accessible that it has become, or it is becoming over the last few months in the past, and now over on to 2023, and how that's going to change things as we go along. The way we think about work, the way we think about coding as developers, and how that's all going to come to a head, perhaps, and the way we think might need a bit of a change. So, with that, over to you, James. Any thoughts about looking back at 2022, a moment, event that stood out for you, human or tech?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm going to point to Twitter, but I'm going to take it from a different angle than I think most people probably are thinking I'm going to take it from. I'm not talking about the sensationalism, the headlines, the controversies. For me, it was watching Twitter. People tweet that they're leaving Twitter, or tweeting that they're going to expand their social network. And I think for me, the lesson was, or reminder was, that a lot of us are looking for the lowest friction way of getting things done. And so a lot of people were leaving Twitter for Mastodon. Mastodon's been around for a while. It's been accessible for quite a while, but it just didn't quite have the push for people to try it out. But when they did, it's a very decentralized way of building a social network, but everybody went centralized. Even though maybe not everybody could stand up their own servers, they still ended up gravitating to the single service that was the primary service. And it was fairly rare to see a tweet where somebody created an account that existed on a server that people didn't know about. It was kind of so people still gravitated towards centralization. And I'm sure there's a lesson learned there that could apply to us in kind of the API space, the API program management space, in the organizations and startup space, whether it's enterprise or startups or whatever else, that we have this tendency to find kind of where everybody's at or where everybody's going, or want to go to kind of a central authority to try to find something. So to me, that was kind of the observation more than any of the other sensationalized headlines that were out there, and everything else was just the human nature of wanting to do that. And what does that mean for us going into 2023 when we think about our API programs? Um, that kind of stood out to me.
Agreed. Thank you so much, James. That's a very interesting take on it, and I think that centralization versus decentralized conversation that's actually come up quite recently when I was doing a bit of research as well. And I think obviously there is another big area around Web 3.0 that we've been talking about for a little while, and where it stands today, the practicality around it, the promise of it all. And I think there is still that element of obviously having that mind shift around decentralization, and how do you merge with what people's psychology would enable or allow them to do at this point of time. And I think that's a very interesting take, and maybe a problem for Web 3.0 to solve as well. But we can probably talk about that a little bit more in detail in our next segment, perhaps. And in this segment, of course, thank you so much for that introductory salvo. Thank you, Martin and James. On to our next segment, we're going to be taking our Hot Tyk segment a little bit further. This is an opinions segment, and just to get your thoughts about some of these areas that obviously, one of which Martin definitely feels very strongly about, that he's already let the whole world know. So let's kick it off with that very topic. So this is your stage once again, Martin. Microservices. What do you think? Force for good, force for evil, Jedi, Sith. Where do you stand with it? And is there an alternative to it?
Right. So microservices. Okay. So first of all, thank you for exposing me so blatantly to the world with that video. I regret making it now. Just for those watching, I was in the background when that came up, and just sort of screaming no into our chat room, going, "How dare you!" So there will be consequences. So what do I actually think of microservices? Well, I do think that they're overblown. I do really worry that we see a lot of customers come our way saying, "Oh, we're adopting microservice," and I'm like, "Well, you guys are a team of 10, but what are you doing with microservice? Who's going to support all this stuff?" There is basically, it's a force for good when used in the right context. Some companies really need them. Netflix probably needs them. Amazon probably needs them. Facebook probably needs them. Does your small startup need them? Probably not. Does your medium scale startup need them? Probably not. Do you need to adopt them because Facebook adopt them? Probably not. It all comes down to using the right tool for the right problem. And in this particular case, I worry that groupthink and trends have dictated what the market decides is good. And then at the same time, we've got companies like Amazon and Google pushing the idea of microservices with Kubernetes and things like that, and sort of saying this is the right way to do it. And the next step for microservices is functions as a service, and just trying to get to this position where you're utilizing more and more and more compute power with the assumption that it is cheaper and almost free, when that's not necessarily the case, because at certain scales, those economies break down, and you end up actually in a position where things are more expensive, things are more costly, not just in terms of hardware, but in terms of people to maintain this scale. And you got to really ask yourself, do we need to maintain this scale? And are there better ways to do it? A lot of scale problems got solved in like the 70s. And one of my favorite examples is Erlang. So Erlang is a programming language that lots of people will know, probably better nowadays as Elixir. It's a framework built on top of Erlang, which is very, very cool and hip if you adopt it. Erlang is based on the actor model, and it's designed around essentially building microservices. But the entire language is built around building these microservices that are idempotent. And Erlang was designed by Ericsson for the GSM network to control huge, massive, distributed call provisioning for mobile phones. So huge traffic, massive data volumes that were just suddenly that were architected for. And I feel like we are reinventing the wheel in some cases with microservices, saying, "Oh, let's go do this again. Just let's do it with Kubernetes and the cloud." And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just trying to draw a parallel between the problems seem to be cyclical, and microservices are the right thing to do when you have large scale. But do you need to do it the way we do now? I don't necessarily know. I'm obviously not an enterprise system architect. I'm not designing the next Twitter, but I do feel like microservices in the using microservices when you don't need them is a problem, and technologists do tend to fall into the trap of following a trend for the sake of it because it makes them sound good, or it's a good thing to put on their CV and it gets them their next job. And all of those kind of factors need to come out when you're making infrastructure decisions. And I do feel like at the moment it's overblown.
Yep. Well, absolutely. I think this is one of those interesting things where I think for a long time, when people were thinking about digital transformation in our space, they were always thinking, how do we get from monolith to microservices? And it was very much that conversation that was driving a lot of these API programs, was driving a lot of these digital transformation, consultants to begin with, but really the entire business is built around just getting people from monolith to microservices. And like you said, in some cases that probably is warranted depending on what scale and what problem you're really trying to solve. But just being a me too simply because somebody else at a greater scale is doing it is probably going to be a very, very costly proposition. So to get your thoughts in on this, James, opinions on microservices. I think there was a time where monoliths were just seen as pure evil, like, oh, if you're doing monoliths,
Yeah.
you do not belong in the digital space anymore. If you're not on microservices, you just you should abandon ship. So your thoughts on how we have come in the journey so far?
Yeah, I agree with Martin a lot on a lot of the points that he raised. Kelsey Hightower from Google had sent out a tweet years ago that I feature a lot of times in my slide decks, and paraphrasing it, I think he roughly said the biggest mistake about monoliths is that people think there can only be one. So they assume that there can only be one monolith inside an entire organization, and that everybody has to contribute to that one monolith. When in reality, we can have multiple monoliths, and we can have small or mid-sized monoliths, and that unit can be managed appropriately and modularly designed. And I think what we've lost in the software engineering world with the advent of all these frameworks and kind of nice little CV builders and everything else is that we lost the ability to design software and to be thoughtful about it. And so we lost the ability to remember what loose coupling and high cohesion are and some of the core foundational principles of software design. And then we go off and we do microservices, which is that in a distributed world. And we go in doing that without understanding the fallacies of distributed computing and the impact of it, and how putting something on the network is going to slow things down. How our tooling today that exists is still not there and sufficient enough. If I want to refactor something, I can refactor a code base, but tell me how I refactor across multiple microservices that are in different repos and different code bases. The tooling's just not there. So the reasoning behind choosing microservices needs to be sound. There are time and a place for it, but like everything, we have to understand the pros and the cons. We have to understand the architectural principles behind it and what trade-offs we're making. And I think a lot of organizations are just adopting it because they think it is the end-all be-all solution, and they're not really understanding that the tooling, the infrastructure costs, the training, um, the difficulties, the coordination can increase. A lot of those things can increase, and I think Uber and others have written about the fact that they've gone down those paths before, and then they think that they're going to have owners of a particular service, and that owning team will be able to make changes to that service. And then all of a sudden, we start implementing a feature, and if we got the boundaries wrong, and the service isn't the right level of granularity or have the right boundaries around it, all of a sudden we have to spend a lot of time trying to understand and coordinate deployments of multiple services all at once, because we've got to go in and we have to, manipulate a number of services at once. So there's good reasons for it. It enables us to solve some good problems, but I think a lot of the software we build isn't complex enough to need to distribute that code across multiple code bases and start involving networks and observable infrastructure and all kinds of additional uh, solutions and operational costs needed to see that benefit. I think that in the end, there might be a really good opportunity for businesses that do software recovery projects to come in and kind of undo some of the things people have done. Or it's going to take somebody coming in and trying to figure out how to back off a little bit from the aggressiveness of it and try to look for some of those more medium-sized coarse grain services to be able to break things down while keeping the code bases manageable, so that, as Martin said, a startup isn't going off and with 10 people trying to build 1,000 microservices, and a big organization isn't doing things so fine grained that they're having to manipulate lots of network calls and then do effectively two-phase commit using sagas and other kinds of techniques to try to overcome things that they introduced to begin with by maybe going down the wrong path if it wasn't the right fit.
Yep. Thank you so much, James. And of course, any person who's watching us live, anyone who's watching, everyone who's watching us live at this point of time, you do feel free to ask your questions. We are going to be taking on these questions beyond what we are talking about right now. So keep them coming, whether you're on YouTube, LinkedIn, or any other platform that you are watching this from. Keep them coming, and we'll be taking them and fielding them and getting the insights from both Martin and James. I think moving on to the next one, which is actually an extension of this particular segment of microservices, which is service mesh. Service mesh and API gateways. It seems like right now we are in slightly muddy waters with what these things actually mean. Are they different things? Are they the same? Is service mesh API management? Is it not? So there's a lot of confusion. Some players have different opinions on this, and of course, we've got our own. So I'm quite curious, perhaps, again, to take your stance on the muddy waters of service mesh and how do we address that? Are they different? Are they the same? What's your take on it? Martin, over to you.
Right. Depends who you're talking to, really. I feel like if you're a microservice aficionado and you think, okay, we're going to do everything with microservices, and you enter those scaling issues where you do have to start worrying about, a whole application that's distributed across thousands of microservices, you need a way to observe that. You need a way to deploy those. You need a way to secure them. And Service Mesh was designed to help deal with the microservice pattern, because the microservice pattern on its own is really hard to manage. So it's kind of like, we built a technology to manage your VMs, we built a technology to manage your smaller VMs, we built a technology to manage your microservices, and it's just one stack on top of the other in order to make this work. And sort of increasing abstraction of complexity. At some point, you go into a microservice, into a service mesh, and you go like, well, what's it actually talking to? Because it's a meta network, right? It sits on top of the actual network. From an engineering standpoint, from a developer standpoint, I really don't like complexity. I mean, the engineers that have seen my code probably disagree, because they'll go, Martin, you love complexity, your code is unreadable. But from an architect's point of view, I really do want to avoid complexity as much as possible. And when you look at service mesh, you go, hang on, I've got to learn Kubernetes. I've got to understand the microservice pattern. Then I've got to deploy that. And then once I've understood that, I have to implement a service mesh, and I have to understand that. So your roadmap for onboarding is really steep. So overall, I think it's not a bad thing. It's a technology designed to solve a problem for a very, very popular software architecture. Fair enough. And depending on who you're talking to, there's a vested interest on whether or not you should adopt it. If I sold you a gateway or a product that was heavily invested in service mesh, then I would tell you that is the best thing to do in service mesh. It's the greatest thing since sliced bread. But if you're talking from an API gateway perspective, it's biased again because we are, well, an API gateway comes from a sort of slightly older way of thinking where you are trying to protect sort of north-south traffic instead of east-west. And in fact, when Service Mesh first came out, there were two deployment models. There was the highly distributed one where you had lots and lots of tiny proxies, and then there was the other version where you had an enterprise, where you had a bus, which was basically an API gateway where you would route all the services through, and then you would just manage the bus. That's fallen by the wayside now for the more distributed approach, but that's where it started. And I do think it is slightly muddy, as you say, between what an API gateway does and what a service mesh does. API gateway, but then if you look at it from this perspective, API gateways are specialized proxies. They are proxies that are laser focused on doing API work and solving problems in that space. And service mesh is an extension of API gateways. It is a proxy that is laser focused on connecting multiple systems and making system calls possible and creating observability layers and security layers across thousands and thousands of microservices. So at their core, they do very similar things. They move traffic from A to B in a certain way, and they create observability and security on top of that. But from a different perspective, they try and solve two very different problems. One is very much focused on securing that sort of your API surface area from the outside world, that north-south traffic, I think is the parlance. And service mesh is very much east-west traffic, although I think API vendors, API management providers will try and tell you that they can do service mesh, and service mesh providers will tell you they can do API management. And to a certain extent, there's a water line there where the mud goes between the oil and the water. If you know what I mean. There's definitely some mixing there in terms of capability. But for the moment, I do see it as that there are two very distinct spaces because, and this is a general problem with service mesh, and in order to use service mesh, you have to adopt microservices, and the only way you're going to adopt microservices is if you adopt Kubernetes. So, your Venn diagram of users gets smaller and smaller as you move down into the center. Whereas an API gateway or an API management platform can work at all scales. It can work with an on-premise monolith, and it can work all the way down at the service mesh layer. So they are different worlds, and they have different scopes, and they solve very, very specific problems. And is it a bad thing? No, it's great that technology is moving on. It creates competition. It creates innovation. As somebody who doesn't like complexity, I find service mesh one of those things where I think, do you really need it? But I'm not going to tell my customers that. Well, shit, I think I just did. So overall, I just feel like it's muddy, but it's not unmanageable, and I think there's plenty of space for both to exist. It's not an either-or scenario. It's not black and white, and it doesn't need to be.
True. I agree with it. I think the key theme, like I've seen over the course of this discussion over the last hour and a half almost, I think there are two key themes that have definitely come up. I think one is the need for efficiency and how to approach that in an organization when you're talking, whether that's development efficiency, whether that is marketing operational efficiency, whether that is revenue operations. So there's a theme around efficiency and how you can approach that from a technology and how technology will enable some of that. And then the second part, like you say right now, is complexification of your overall stack, your overall product, because ultimately the more complex things are, the more time you need to spend not just building it, but to maintain it. There's going to be more time and effort that is needed to actually understand it if the teams are no longer available. And in some cases, if it's a one-person team, then that's probably going to take some time to decomplexify as well. So absolutely agree with you on that. I think the key theme here to understand, again, horses for courses, right tools for your business, whichever one works for you, is going to be dependent on truly what your use case is and whether you have the right people, whether you have the right process to actually approach it. So I think that's going to be my takeaway. Quick thoughts from you, James. Anything else to add on this before we move on to the next question?
Just briefly, I agree with that. I think for me, what I recognize and recommend for clients is understand and examine the need. And I think service mesh, there's different. They come in different forms. You can get something very minimal that can address a few situations for observability and fault tolerance and a few of our common patterns, distributed computing patterns that we need to put in there. And a service mesh might be a good fit. And maybe you don't need a big vendor solution. You might just need something small and lightweight to insert in there to get you what you need. But a lot of clients come to me and say, "Should I have one?" And I'll say, "Do you need one?" So that's what I would challenge anyone that's trying to figure it out. Do you really need one? If so, challenge yourself to figure out one, could you revisit the architectural decisions and guidance that you have for the way you're building software to eliminate its needs so you can simplify things? And maybe either use it as a temporary stopgap until you can get to that point, or say, ask yourself, what is it from the service mesh you really need, and focus in on that, and try not to go whole in taking on every little feature and that's enabled inside of someone's service mesh. Figure out what you need, implement that part, and move forward and see if it works for you. Because as you said, there's a lot of complexity. It's going to bring in more humans to handle more infrastructure and operations that may be unnecessary if we think differently about how we architect our software. So just use a little bit of caution. Make sure that you're selecting for the right reasons and not because you're trying to tick a box.
Absolutely. Well, we've got our first question from the audience, which is really really good. So I'm going to sub that in before I get into my own question. So, and this is again a topic which we did touch upon really early on into today's event, but it is a topic that's close to our hearts once again. So, GraphQL. All right. So the question here is, what is next for GraphQL? Where does it stand today? And what do you see as the future of GraphQL as we evolve? So I'll probably rephrase that a little bit, perhaps, and maybe add in my little dose of spice into that. GraphQL, is it going through an existential crisis at this point of time? Or is it merely adopting to the changing needs of its user base? So I'll go over to you, James, to kick this off. GraphQL, your thoughts on it? Existential crisis or evolving technology?
It's been an interesting journey to watch so far. Most teams that I've seen adopting GraphQL are using it because they need speed of development between their front end and their back end. And oftentimes it's because the front end is actually sometimes responsible for building out some of the back end or all of the back end. And so they want something that's very efficient, effective, that they can handle both sides of. At least that's what I've seen. I know some organizations are using it for federation. I know Tyke supports that as well. I know that's an interesting use case that's starting to emerge. Whether it's a single federated GraphQL for an entire organization or segmented based on particular areas. But to me, I think it feels like it's sort of well. What I'll say is I come from the SOAP days too. So anybody that's been around during the SOAP days and the SOA days, it was very reminiscent of that. When I had to deal with SOAP, I had to help a startup airline get off the ground literally, and they were using SOAP services, and we had to implement a middleware that was very much like an API gateway. And so we had to write lots of plugins for that middleware so that it can understand every payload that we're sending between it because everything's tunneled through HTTP. SOAP by itself supports multiple protocols, so it just kind of tunnels through HTTP, and it's not unlike GraphQL. So from the operational side and of it, I see a lot of challenges, and I see a lot of people that say that kind of are short sighted and aren't looking at the operational side of GraphQL. And so they say, "Yep, works for me on my laptop. This is great. I wrote a few lines of code. I wrote a resolver. I got a few things up and running, wired it in, and I'm all set." And they don't realize what's really involved to rate limit it, to secure it with fine grain authorization, data entitlements, all the things that you see, at least in the enterprise world, that you're oftentimes bumping into. And so it becomes a challenge. So I think it's in this maturity phase where some people are using it with success. And I think people are trying it because they're curious. And then they're kind of going down a path and hitting some walls and going, "Oh, wow. Okay. Now I need to write this, this intelligent piece of code that goes onto some middleware, whether it's as a plugin inside of a gateway like Tyke or if it's something else, to be able to enforce security. Or I've got to rewrite what an API gateway would normally give me in my code base so that I can enforce it at the code level so I can make the right decision to ensure that I'm shaping the response correctly and dropping fields that they're not allowed to see and so on. And then, putting in some error messages accordingly to give a partial response back. So for me, I'm seeing a bit of a challenge, and it's a bit reminiscent of things that were happening about 20 years ago. So I'm curious and excited to see where it goes. I know it's solving some problems for people, so I don't doubt that. But I think the operationalization side of it, because of the way it's designed, it was designed to solve a specific problem, and I think we're trying to push it to solve new problems. And it's going to be interesting to see where that goes and how we end up addressing that. Is GraphQL going to evolve, or is it that we're going to have to shove more middleware solutions in there and find ways to do that without making it difficult to do distributed deployments like we had in SOA, where we have to deploy code to our middleware that's aware of the payload whenever we make a change, and also deploy code for our changes to our services and everything else all at the same time and coordinate those deployments so that everything's in sync and we don't have any kind of runtime errors. So we saw that a lot in the SOA days. Want to learn from that and try to avoid that if possible. So excited to see where it goes.
Great. Martin, just curious again from where GraphQL has come to. Obviously, there was an original vision behind it. There was a need for GraphQL when it first came out. It was trying to solve a specific problem with REST, and it was the answer for omni-channel application building, or trying to essentially speak to multiple data sources and bringing that data all together into one single unified graph. And I think that was kind of the problem that it was addressing at that point of time. Do you see a lot of the challenges that GraphQL is facing right now is born out of the fact that now that those initial use cases have been hit, we're now looking at a world which is trying to scale and trying to figure out a problem for GraphQL at scale, perhaps, and GraphQL is probably not quite there yet with some of those, or has certain issues when it comes to looking at massive scale productions, perhaps?
So GraphQL, it's interesting. GraphQL was, as James said, it was initially designed to solve the one-to-many problem of single-page web apps and mobile applications. You have a mobile app, you need to build 6 different components of your view, and those are all individual API calls, and making 6, 7, 10 different API calls is expensive, both on the client and for the server. And so GraphQL was a way to say, oh, maybe we can make this a bit nicer. And yeah, it's very reminiscent of the SOAP days and RPC and things like that, where you make a single query and you get lots of data back, but you don't actually know what's happening in the background. And with that regard, it solved that problem. Great, and it's fine how it is now. The thing is, you've got something like microservices showing up, and then they go, well, how do we scale GraphQL across microservices? And the scaling issue, the solution was federation, it's called GraphQL Federation. And it is an additional layer of complexity on top of something that is already quite complex. GraphQL to implement at the server side is an expensive component. You've kind of, especially if you're coming from REST, you're kind of going, oh, I have to take my REST services and now I have to write a resolver. Then I have to put that resolver somewhere and run it. And then I have to plug that into my GraphQL gateway. You still need something to take the GraphQL request, transform it, and make the outbound data query, whether it's to a database or a REST service, or through multiple layers. So you're building all this middleware, and that's a bit of a kludge. It's not great. And Federation was built to sort of designed to solve this, and now you've got Federation v2, which is different and not properly backwards compatible. So overall, GraphQL is going through a transition of saying, it was initially designed for single-page web apps and mobile applications for the front end, for the client design folks to make their lives easier. And it is now finding itself moving up the stack into the server side so that you actually have calls between systems that are GraphQL-based instead of client-server. And the thing is, there's already a lot of stuff that solves that problem. There's gRPC, and there's Facebook's own one. I keep forgetting its name. There's several binary protocols, which are basically RPC protocols that handle system-to-system comms and try to get the scaling issue done using gateways or service mesh patterns and working at that level, as opposed to having to add another layer of complexity on top of it. So now, back to the existing example of service mesh, you've got Kubernetes, your microservices, your service mesh, and your microservices are now also running GraphQL resolvers, which are translating requests coming in so they can become something else. It's bonkers, if you ask me, once you sort of look at the depths of complexity, just, in some cases, to maybe just render a cat video on on your Instagram feed, whatever it may be. So I do feel GraphQL is going through. It was seen as sort of this big savior. It is like JavaScript, kind of being pushed into the server side and hitting lots and lots of barriers with regards to scale. And we're entering that trial of disillusionment where people are going like, is this really the right tool for the job? Now, we have, not to toot our horn, but we have a really excellent GraphQL tool, and we have a really excellent sort of future vision for GraphQL, which we call our universal data graph. And that's essentially saying, well, if we want to do GraphQL in the server, you don't want to have to write a bunch of resolvers. You don't want to have to do all of that complexity. You want to plug your existing infrastructure into it and just immediately take advantage of GraphQL. And the way we see GraphQL, the way I see it, is when you look at GraphQL as what it's designed to do, which is meant to connect lots and lots of microservices into a single query, you actually see an integration pattern. And in at least in my view, one of the places where GraphQL can have a great impact is integrating multiple services for your service developers to be able to query the entire thing, to be able to query all of your microservices as a single database almost. And in that regard, you're kind of looking at older patterns where you try to do that with an enterprise service bus or SOA, for example, or just writing lots of proxies or transactions where you group REST calls into batches and try to get them to work to write complex middleware. Instead of doing that, you can just simplify it with GraphQL, and your front end can use it, and your server side can use it, and all of a sudden you have this magic mirror to all of your data sources. Very cool. But again, you've got folks having to say, well, I still have to adopt GraphQL. We have to go through this learning curve and say, is this really the right thing? And to be honest, most of the customers we speak to about GraphQL, they see it as something they would like to adopt, something that they're very interested in. It is it sits on their roadmap in the future because they think it's cool, but it's usually alongside RESTful services. You still have your RESTful services. And in some cases, and this is where it gets super bonkers, you've got your, let's say, your microservice architecture, which is running all on REST or something, and then you have a GraphQL layer on top of that in order to develop against this microservice backend in a cohesive way. But you don't want to expose GraphQL to your customers because those APIs, they need, as James said, they need to be secured and rate limited and all that kind of stuff. Plus, there's so many different routes it can take that you could end up with cascading failures. However, so then you've got folks saying, let's build a REST resolver against GraphQL. So you have a REST API that is specific for maybe a specific kind of query that then calls into GraphQL, which then calls into REST. And it gets really crazy. It gets really bizarre. So I think we're getting into levels of silliness with GraphQL where we really need to understand, well, either we really get GraphQL right and we secure it and we turn it into something that anybody can consume at the client side, or whether that be server or mobile client or browser, and make that just a decent pattern that's easy to adopt. Or we simply say, look, this is actually a very good server-side component, and there are scaling, the solutions to scaling with federation are actually very elegant once you adopt them. But in that case, you then need to really solve the client-side access piece. Does that make sense? I'm not sure. I'm kind of talking in circles.
I think the key takeaway, once again, it comes down to back to basics, doesn't it? Where once again you're thinking about use cases and you're thinking about decomplexifying your solution, putting together REST with GraphQL with REST in front again. Is it necessary? Maybe in some cases, but is it really? So I think it really comes down to what you are specifically looking at it from your. Is it valuable enough to invest that time, that resource into something like this, which will, that return on investment that comes to investing on, say, something like GraphQL, is it worth it? Is it valuable? For some organizations, absolutely. I think we've seen the likes of Airbnb, we've seen the likes of Netflix who are using it at scale, and it has been highly beneficial for them, the way they are doing it. But are you at that scale? Do you really need it? Do you have that resource to back up that kind of development maintenance on an ongoing basis? Maybe, maybe not. So it really comes down to, again, those first principles of thinking about efficiency, decomplexification, and then the right tool for the right job. So I think that's kind of the key takeaway. So thank you so much for that question. I think we've got a whole lot coming in, and I'm also aware that we are exactly on time. So maybe we'll keep going for a little while. We've got a couple more questions to go before we probably close this out. So let's take a couple more top questions that have come in. And one's been very interesting because, again, we've spoken about this people-centric approach to APIs and some of the impactful things that APIs can lead to and enable. But at the same time, the people who are helming APIs and the development and the creation of APIs, again, become quite important in actually governing something like that. So question to you, James, in this case, where we talk about whether technologists alone can be trusted to build APIs, or do you, once again, does that need more voices? Does that need voices, not just, need more voices internally, but also feedback and what that overall cycle looks like for your application development, not just tech driven, perhaps, not just CV driven in some cases, but that holistic look at how do you build APIs and API first products?
Yeah, one of the reasons why I'm specialized in this space of APIs, I'm really passionate about it and have been. I've been involved with it for nearly a decade now. Is it's specifically focused on modern APIs. Is that it incorporates three key ingredients. It comes at the intersection of business, product, and technology. What we design as an API has an impact on other people. If I'm a developer working inside of a single code base and we all agree to use Java or Node or Ruby or Python or Golang or whatever it is, and we agree on some libraries, we can make that decision as a technology group. And other than the velocity that it might, increase or decrease based on our choices, maybe the learning curve if we're adopting something new and it's a little bit riskier, might slow us down a little bit until we get everybody trained up and ready to go. Whatever the case is, we can isolate that risk to a specific team or a group of people. When you design an API and you open that up, whether it's in a large enterprise and one team inside the enterprise is designing and deploying an API, and someone else in another part of the organization is going to use it, or if you're teeing something up for partners, customers, whatever it is that you're delivering, um, you have communication paths and you have dependencies that are outside your control. And so we have to do more than just sit down and think about the technology. We have to do more than just get excited about specific services that we're building. That's all great. But what is the contract? What is the agreement we have? What is our communication? So I like to say that APIs are a conversation, and there's three levels of conversation. There's the human to human, there's the machine to machine, and there's the developer to developer. So the human to human is, does my API deliver outcomes that weren't possible before? It's either automating something on my behalf or enable me to do something from a web or mobile app or via from a voice app or whatever it is. There's the developer to developer. Can I communicate how to use this API through appropriate documentation, code examples, reference apps, all the things that are necessary to deliver a great developer experience? And then there's machine to machine. And that's where most of us focus on as developers. And so if we just let developers purely in isolation design an API and deliver an API, they're probably going to focus more on the machine to machine side unless they really have a background in product ownership, product development, that kind of background where they're able to blend that. They're really going to be drilled into, what are the HTTP methods? What's my JSON look like? What's my GraphQL schema look like? Whatever it is. What does my IDL look like for gRPC? And they're going to focus on that, and they're going to miss the opportunity to solve real problems for real humans and get that human to human conversation going. So a lot of what I do in my training and consulting in the recent book that I wrote for Addison Wesley is to focus on that. How do you go from requirements and focus on the human to human aspect, and then take it to the machine to machine, the developer to developer conversations? And that's really what's important. So it has to be cross functional teams. It has to be people that are representing the business or the product or some combination of that, to have stakeholders, to get feedback, to have conversations about designs, not just immediately start coding and see what your API design is going to evolve into and focus on just purely the machine to machine. And I think we miss an opportunity there if we don't have those conversations early and often.
Yep. Thank you for that, James. just as an extension of this, over to Martin, I think there is always this curiosity from developers when we talk about this, where obviously we are talking a little bit more about having certain governances in place, certain practices and processes in place, but sometimes it's seen as a hindrance to innovation. So where is that right balance between, finding that tool that you find exciting and you want to try it out and you want to bring that into the fold versus, okay, do we have the right practices and processes in place to actually adopt it in a more sustainable way, or is this a one-off? So that balance between innovation versus standardization, what's your take on that?
Oh, this is a problem every company faces, and it's not just limited to APIs. I think it's just the general idea that do you move fast and break things, and therefore essentially embed technical debt into your future growth and just accept it? Or do you sit and take time to really design your solution properly? And it depends on what situation you're in, to be perfectly honest. If your entire business model relies on the adoption and successful deployment of your services, not UI, not UX, there's no other USP except for this API and the developer experience, then you need a design first approach. You need to immediately think, because your API is the product. And so you should look at it like any other product. You should go through a product design process. You should probably do design first, make it have a multifaceted team sitting and talking to each other in order to make sure this thing goes to market. If, however, the situation is more of a, okay, we're building service-to-service calls internally, or we're building services internally that support a wider product that might have externally facing APIs, then yeah, go fast and break stuff. Do we really need to have a whole design-centric approach just for those particular services? It really depends. It all depends on who your consumers are. And ultimately, yes, you could argue that inside an organization, your consumers are other developers, but within an organization, even if your internal APIs are other developers, you don't necessarily need to think of it as a product to an extent as you would for the polish needed to do an externally facing product. Because ultimately, you can go and get your developers to talk to each other, and you can sort of build that support through documentation and some kind of tribal knowledge. I know that's a poo-poo word for developer teams, and something people want to avoid because everything should be documented, and developers should never have to speak to each other, and they should be able to operate in complete darkness in a cave and never have to communicate to the outside world and just be given their tasks. But that's not the world we live in. That's not the type of companies people run. That's not how humans work. So there's two sides to it. I think it's very important for anything that is externally facing and product-led, where your API is the product or is a significant component of your revenue, then yeah, you want to go and design that API well, and you want to spend a lot of time thinking about who's going to use it, how they're going to use it, how they're going to interact with your organization programmatically. On the flip side, whether if you have internal problems you need to get done, sometimes just to bring a capability or to run a POC or something like that, yeah, go for it. Go build something fast and break it. But set those expectations right up front. And that's something that doesn't always happen. You've got to go out front and say, by the way, this is going to break. And it might not get maintained anymore. So use it at your own risk. Very much like most open source software is released. So don't build anything critical. Don't build anything mission critical on something that your intern built because it was cool. Right? And I guess those are two extremes. But you got to find yourself somewhere in the middle of that. The long iteration cycles for product can cause frustration both for customers and for your internal teams, because stuff takes so long to get out the door that you actually might miss the boat. And it really is down to really understanding what the demand is and how much time you've got to get something to market in order to sort of prioritize those two demands, because they will always be in conflict. Do I have time to do it right? Will I make money? And in a pre-revenue startup, for example, they'll be like, well, we got to get this to market because we need people to buy it. On the other hand, if you get the wrong thing to market, people won't buy it. But there's a middle ground there. In reality, it's never got to be. And there's that saying, and it has to be said every single time: do not let perfect get in the way of good. Right? And because people are perfectionists, they're always going to want to take the design first approach. And sometimes they shouldn't. But that's a controversial opinion. I'm very much of the pantser, seat of the pants style design process where I much rather sit there, pock something, write it up, and get it out the door in order to test it against the market. Much to the annoyance of my engineering team, who then turn around and say, "Martin, why did you do this to us? I must now suffer." So I'm sorry, team. I will do it again.
Yeah, I
Oh
like
well.
what you said
Well,
about the
we've come this far.
expectation.
Sorry. Go on.
I was just going to say, I really like what you said about setting expectations. That's really key. I've seen product companies come out and they say, well, we'll just label our API V0. And they'll put V0 in the
Yeah.
path, kind of indicating that it's a pre-release or an experimentation. Then they'll start signing contracts against it. And then it becomes V1, but it's V0. And then they're trying to figure out how to get people to V1 or V2 or whatever they want to call it because they did that. So there are just some different challenges, but setting expectations is really, really important.
Well, thank you so much once again. I think there is that little balance to try and figure out where we stand with what we want to achieve, and then what are we willing to give up to be able to achieve that. And once again, perfect is not usually the goal. We are good with good enough to get started. And in some cases, if you're, like you say, a pre-revenue startup, you might be taking on some technical debt in favor of going to market early. And I think as long as you're aware of it, your team is aware of it, and have a roadmap to actually address some of that, you're probably going to be golden. But well, with that, if you're curious, where I'm looking at it, looking on the right hand side, or maybe it's left for you, I'm not sure. It's about the questions that are coming in, and unfortunately, we are already 12 minutes over. So I think I'm going to stop us with not stop us, but pretty much close out this particular session with a look forward into what is coming up next in 2023. And this is a two-part question. I think one of the questions is around a topic that we touched upon previously with Claire, really about an inclusive, diverse, and an equal world. It's a very important topic as we move into 2023, coming off of a rather shaky 2022. And moving into 2023, of course. So curious again. So there is obviously a lot of talk around this, and I think we've seen some really great points coming off of that earlier session. But the key question that a lot of people have is, as an organization, how do we get started with something like this? What are the things that we can do today, and how do we plan for a more diverse, inclusive, and equal environment in the future? Martin, perhaps we'll kick this off with you. We know it's something that's very, very important for us, and we've taken a few steps, but your take on it as CEO and founder.
Oh, diversity inclusion is a big deal. I find, well, our own company. So Tyk itself it's a global company. We have staff like, I think, in something like 26 different countries, and they're all over the place across every continent except for Antarctica almost. And we are, I think, at the moment we're at 36% female to male. So we could be doing better. But what I'm trying to say is we're already a bit of a melting pot. And what I quite like about that is the reason it's important is bringing different perspectives together simply improves how we overall see each other. If you're building an organization with a monoculture, so you're building, let's say, in a single country, you'll still have diversity and inclusion problems because there are subcultures within the monoculture. So let's say only building in the United Kingdom or only building in the United States, there's still a common ground around like, oh, we all live in the United States. That doesn't exist in a real global company where everybody has to work together, where you've got like folks working from Turkey with folks in the States and from all different backgrounds, ethnicities, genders, and orientations. And I think having those viewpoints represented and forcing people to think about who's on the other side of that chat box, who's on the other side of that call, and how do they see the world, and trying to really understand that brings a much bigger understanding to the type of users you might be speaking to. It's very, very easy to be myopic about a market you're speaking to or a type of user. But if you really want to, I don't know, build a great place to work, you need to make sure that everybody feels safe. And it comes down to safety. It's not so much about meeting quotas. They need to feel safe to be themselves. They need to feel safe to express themselves, and they need to feel safe that when they come to work, nothing's going to happen. They have measures and support in place should something happen. and that they are respected. It's easy for me to say I'm a white cis male, so up here in terms of privilege, as expressed in the Western context. But I think we need to constantly be vigilant around making sure people are included and making sure that we are treating others fairly and that we are building equity, not just equality. It's both sides. The thing is, unfortunately, in a company is not a country, and there are different motives at play. You have profit motives, you have organizational motives, you have overall having to keep staff happy, and there's a lot of I might be rambling a little bit here. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of
No.
components that fall together
No, this is
that need.
something that is very close to you. I'm very I'm aware of it, having worked with you with this, and I think the key thing that I think from what I take away from that is, obviously, I think as an organization, one thing is thinking about the right hiring patterns and putting that in place, perhaps the way you hire people and how you approach that, perhaps, but also equally having the environment within to actually encourage more people to join you, the culture that goes behind it, the safety, the security that people would feel. So I think it's like the two-pronged process, of course, looking for people more intentionally, and almost not intentionally in the sense of filling out a quota, but intentionally in the sense that, okay, you're looking for people who are right for the job and opening up the opportunity for everyone. It's not limited by geography. It's not limited by a specific race or anything else. It's very much, there are no limits. And I think that's the whole point of remote work in some cases. And being a remote first company, that is something that we can actually bring to the fore as well.
There is, sorry, just to cut in one more time, but there's one more thing, and that is, it's something that I try to explain. Maybe I explain it badly, but especially in a remote company, there is no office, right? There's no monoculture you can bring people into and say, this is one place where, once you enter this building, this is how we behave and these are the values we believe in. You are dealing with people who are working within their own context, right? So if I am a Muslim living in Turkey, or I am, I don't know, a Palestinian living in Canada, or a Palestinian living in Palestine, or an Iranian living in Iran, whichever, pick something. The organization, you are not coming to the organization when you join the Slack channel. You're not going into an office. The organization is coming to you, right? So all of a sudden, when people speak to you and when they have expectations of how you should behave, you are in your own context. You can't suddenly change how you see the world, because you have to live within the context that you live in. And so it kind of ends up boiling down to lowest common denominator to find the common ground that unites everybody, as opposed to trying to enforce values. It's very hard to do that. You can't sit there and say, well, we have to enforce a certain Western value on these folks that are working for us in somewhere that doesn't believe in those values, even though they, disregarding the ethical nature of whether it's right or wrong and on what side you sit on there. The issue is the fact that the person you're talking to, that the specific staff member and team member, has to live within that cultural context. So, and it could be the case that if they start espousing or start communicating in a way that espouses other beliefs, that they could actually get in trouble. It could actually be bad for them. I mean, like, for example, in Russia now, it is illegal to expose, to even communicate LGBTQ values in any way. It's become a full-blown law that you can't express yourself in that community. So if anything you do, you can be thrown in jail. You can be punished for it. So now, if you were a Western company with a Russian employee who happens to be in that community and says, "Well, why aren't you more of an activist, or why are you suppressing it, or trying to be woke?" I hate that word, but trying to be progressive in that way, which is good. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Please, by all means, we should be living our values. We can't expect our staff members to be living those in their context. We'd be putting them in danger, and that's a really thin line. It's hard to be an ethical corporation that wants to do right by its staff and by its diverse community when you are actually working remotely. You are forcing those views, or forcing somebody else to espouse those views in some way, it's good to ask them to respect them, but you have to know where the boundaries lie in terms of when it's okay for monoculture to slip through those cultural boundaries within somebody else's context. And it's a super weird example, but it's a reverse colonialism. You can't sort of say, oh, well, we're a Western company, so I don't care if you live in Qatar. You have to live our values. And you're like, holy shit, that's not
Yeah,
going to work. You can't do that to somebody,
that's
they'll be
not
in jail.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah,
So, and those are
and
extreme
I think that
cases, but
cultural
there's subtler ones as well.
and that
Go on,
cultural thing is
sorry,
something that
I'll shut up
I've
now.
also looked into. No, no worries. I looked into as well because obviously I come from India, and I think the way we think about things is a little bit different. But then again, I've lived in Singapore for almost 13 years, and they have a completely different stance on a few different things. There are similarities, but also differences. And now I've moved all the way over to the United States, and it definitely thinks very, very differently in a lot of different things. So there is that adjustment and understanding of what impacts you, where you stand as an individual, what are things that you are willing to be a part of, to integrate with, and then the things that matter to you enough to say, no, this is where, this is my take. I'm not going to force this on you, but this is where I stay. And I think organizations respecting that perhaps is a part of that cultural look and cultural integration overall, where we are not just, again, putting our stance on what it is to be part of the organization, but to the whole world at large, because that's what we think is the right thing to do. But it is really down to being respectful of what people think. But obviously, there are boundaries to be put in place where still people feel secure and safe to work and come to work in these remote environments as well. So that would be sort of my 2 cents there. Um, I think I'm going to move right along. Unless James, if you have any, key things to contribute to this, otherwise we will move on to the next segment.
No, I appreciate everything Martin shared, and he actually brought some things up that I hadn't even thought about as well. So it's been a great conversation. I appreciate it.
So
Yeah.
last question. So again, we have looked back at 2022. The final little bit here is about what you are looking forward to in 2023, both once again from a humanities perspective, from tech perspective, or both in unison. James, perhaps we'll kick this off with you. What are you looking forward to in 2023?
I think I've seen sort of the tail end of this year starting to give us a preview of what next year will look like, at least in the API space. The things that I'm seeing are pretty exciting. I'm seeing a lot of organizations start to incorporate more of the human perspective into APIs. Um, we were kind of, Martin was mentioning this earlier, not just from a staffing of an organization, but really just kind of incorporating the feedback and the input of what we're doing in the API space and in technology in general, trying to incorporate more and more of being aware of everything beyond our immediate sphere. It used to be that we were focused on what was in our town and then what was in our state or province or region, and then now we're so global these days that it requires us to think more and more about the human to human side of things. So when I was talking earlier about APIs being a human to human conversation, I'm excited and seeing kind of an early stage of people really sitting down and trying to understand more about what the human aspect of this is, whether it's building software, whether it's building a business, or if it's in my case focused heavily on the API side of things. That human perspective is going to be key. I know that the way things are kind of going as a result of this year, things are going to be a little bit tighter on budgets. I think there's going to be some challenges in some areas for some organizations in that way, but I think that's where organizations can really step up and stand out, and they can actually start bringing in the human side of things and really make a difference. So to me, that's kind of what I'm seeing. We see AI. Martin, you mentioned AI earlier, and kind of the growth of that and that trend kind of standing out. If it helps us be able to do things as humans better or support us as humans better and not just make us more robots in front of a keyboard and a monitor, then I think we're headed in the right direction. And it's been fascinating to see some of those things. So I'm excited for the next year to see where things head from that perspective and to really get more human aspects into our software, into our APIs as we move forward into the new year.
Great. Thanks, James. Over to you, Martin, for your exciting thing for 2023, perhaps from humanity, from tech. Maybe not as exciting, but at least back to sanity in some cases. But what are you looking forward to in 2023?
Well, I think this is probably not very technology specific, but ultimately the 2022 has been a bit of a roller coaster. 2021 was a roller coaster. we haven't really had a series of years where we kind of gone, gosh, nothing's happened. It's been quite uneventful. I would very much welcome going back to having some boring news. Somebody misspelled potato, or here in New Zealand where I live, the news used to make like headline news if somebody was attacked by a cow. Now it's all about anti-vaxxers and geopolitics, and you kind of go, well, come on, guys, let's settle down a bit. So what I would like to see in 2023 is a bit more calm, maybe. I probably won't get it, but just a little bit more stability. Because we're a remote company, we are heavily affected by what happens out there in the world. 2 years ago, we were trying to hire some DevOps engineers, and we had an excellent recruit, absolutely perfect for the job. We wanted to offer him the job, but he was in Iran, and Iran was under embargo. So we could not in any way hire this person because it would put at risk our work with American government clients, right? Or more recently, we have staff both in Russia and the Ukraine, and we've had to help some of them escape, and we've had to try and make sure that these folks are still productive if they want to be productive, if they want to work, and make sure they have the space to recover. And you know what? I really don't want to have to deal with that. I really don't think anybody should have to deal with that kind of stupid situation. So it would be very nice if 2023 would just calm down. Pardon my French. So what I'm looking forward to is, maybe a cease in hostilities, and preferably maybe some kind of calming down of this bloody pandemic, which we are still in. But that's my old man rant. So my apologies. From a business perspective, it's just been a little bit stressful. So the next thing is going to be, of course, this recession everybody's talking about, which I'm not looking forward to, and I'm hoping we somehow manage to avoid, or at least it's going to be slightly less. As I said, there's going to be contraction in the industry, or that's expected. I would say I'm not looking forward to that, but I am looking forward to the challenge of trying to beat it. I'm not going to let the world get us down, man.
Fair enough. Absolutely. Hopeful, less exciting, but hopeful and calm. I think that's what we are hoping for at this point of time. I am completely with you. 2022, obviously, at world at large has been, there's been ups and downs all across, and there's been a lot of uncertainty. I'm hoping for the same with myself as well, just settling down a little bit from where I am today, with even in Boston's negative temperatures, try and settle in a little bit more and see what the new year has to bring for us all. Hopefully a peaceful, calmer, hopeful 2023 is ahead of us. So with that note, thank you so much. It has been a fantastic conversation, both Martin and James. I'm sure we can go on for a little longer as well, and longer more. But thank you once again. This has been fantastic.